Good morning and welcome to Momentum Global Matters. My name is Ray Mere and I'm Head of Investment Distribution here at Momentum. With me in studio is my colleague, Kapil Joshi, who's the Head of Momentum Collective Investment Schemes. So Kapil, what do you think of our new three-dimensional studio here?
I think it's amazing, and I love how Momentum Investments has embraced the future with our events in the last 12 months. For all of you watching at home, let me tell you a little secret. None of this is real. Not the plants, not the couches, not the walls, the floors, or the ceilings. Ray, should we show them where we really are?
Why not? For everybody tuned in today, we have an incredible lineup of investment experts from around the world who will be sharing their insights and views about the past 12 months and also the road ahead.
But before we get to our first speaker, just a few things for all of you to note. Not only did we build our new beautiful virtual studio, we thought it also needed a home. You're watching this from our brand new Momentum Investments events website. This website has a couple of really neat features. At the top of the landing page, you will see that we give you access to our agenda, profiles for each of our speakers, and a great way to navigate this conference.
In addition to that, our download section has links to all the presentations, information packs from all our presenters, and links to video content you might find interesting. As we move into the future, this website will continue to grow and become your home for investment information. Our investment specialists are on hand to answer any questions you may have during the event, so please post your questions in the chat box for us to respond to them. If you need any more information regarding our capabilities or investment solutions, please request a callback and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Kapil, shall we get the show on the road?
Let's do that.
Greg Davis is the Head of Behavioural Science at Oxford Risk in the UK. And next to me here in studio is Paul Nixon, who is the Head of Behavioural Finance at Momentum Investments here in South Africa. Greg, this is the first of his research on noise in investment advice. So the question is, how noisy is your investment advice? We're going to need some context here on this one to clear things up. So perhaps let's start with the obvious question. What's noise and why should we care?
Thanks. Yeah, this is something I'm very excited about because it coincides with the launch of Daniel Kahneman's new book on noise. Now, Daniel Kahneman is the father of behavioral economics. He won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002. And what you will have seen is that over the last 20 years, a lot of the behavioral research has been around bias rather than noise. And if you look at those targets on screen, you can see if we're trying to make a decision and our decisions are consistent and they're accurate, there's always going to be a little bit of variation. So that target there where they're all clustered around the bullseye, there's a little bit of variation, but they're tightly clustered and our decisions are hitting the target roughly time after time. If we're biased, like in the bottom left there, our decisions are tightly clustered in the sense that we're doing the same thing time after time, but we're off target. That's bias, and that's where a lot of the historical focus has been. The issue here is noise. We can find a situation where our decisions on average are accurate, but that doesn't matter because if every one of those little crosses on the target is an individual client and they're each getting the answer that's wrong for them, it doesn't matter to them as individuals whether on accurate the system is correct because each of them is getting the wrong answer. And that is noise. That's what we need to be concerned about when we're doing things like giving advice to people. Are they getting the answers that are consistent and suitable for their needs?
Okay, that makes sense. But let's zoom in a bit more on financial advice here. How do we even start to come to grips with how much noise there is?
Yeah, so if we look at the next slide there with the triangle, when we're thinking about financial advice, there are really three layers to that triangle that we need to be concerned about if you're going to give someone the right advice. At the top is someone's willingness to take risk, their risk tolerance, the degree to which they are willing to trade off risk in return for their long-term outcomes. It's a personality trait. It's something that we can measure accurately using psychometric tools, and it's the anchoring point for good advice. But it's not everything. The second layer is, how do I adjust the right level of risk for you to take into account your financial ability to take risk? This is about your financial circumstances now. Do you have a big mortgage? How many kids do you have? Do you have a lot of spending needs? What is the size of your portfolio? Every one of these things influences the right answer for you to take advice. And then right at the bottom of the pyramid is your emotional ability to withstand the journey. Are you someone who's likely to be anxious as the markets go up and down, and therefore even if you're in the right portfolio for you, you're going to start making mistakes. You're going to get nervous, you're going to get anxious, and you're going to jump out at the bottom or make costly, emotionally driven decisions along the way. Now, all three parts of these layers are very important in establishing the right answer. So what we have done in order to investigate noise is we've gone to hundreds of advisors, South African advisors, and given them case studies, individual clients where we say, here is pretty much everything you need to know to establish the right answer for those clients. So there's information about every layer of that pyramid. Essentially, they get a little biography of the client, they get a description of the financial circumstances of the client, they get evidence from a psychometric test about what the risk tolerance of that client is. And then we've asked these advisors, so now you've got all the information you need, what do you think is the right answer for each of those clients? And then we look at the data that comes back and we see how noisy is it.
I think we can all agree that we need at least some level of consistency when advising clients. What's your approach to measuring this, Greg? Can you tell us a bit about the research design?
So let's look at some of that data. What you see here is the risk level that all these advisors suggested was appropriate for each of these clients. Now, it's very typical in financial advice to put clients on a scale, maybe a 5-point scale or here a 7-point scale. How much risk is suitable for this client to have given everything I know about their financial circumstances and the three layers of that pyramid? And the design here was very deliberate. So, for example, client 1 and client 4 are exactly the same in financial circumstances, except that they have a difference in risk tolerance. So the way we designed this survey enables us to tease out what is influencing the advisor's answers here. But the fundamental takeaway from this slide is you can see it doesn't matter which client we're talking about, which case study we've given to advisors. The answers that come back are all over the place. Each client has suggested risk levels, everything from very low to very high. And that is the noise in the system. That tells us that there's an awful lot of stuff going on that isn't about the client. It's about the advisor or about the surrounding circumstances. And that means that a given client visiting an advisor 1 month or the next month, for the same client, they may get a different answer. Or it means that a client going to 5 different advisors may get 5 different answers, regardless of the fact that their situation is exactly the same from time to time. Now, the next thing we want to know is, okay, so we've established the risk level for a client, and that's noisy. But you might think that, well, once we've established that a client is risk level 3, then all advisors should be giving risk level 3 roughly the same answer, right? They should be getting the same riskiness of the portfolio. So we also investigated once the advisor has given the client an actual risk level, are they giving them an investment solution that matches that? And on that next slide, you can see this. Now there is good news here. As we move from risk level 1 to risk level 7, you can see that the equity allocation, the proportion of risky assets in that portfolio goes up systematically from low risk to high risk. And that's exactly as we should see it. However, even here, there's a lot of noise in the system. So let's just look, for example, at those clients that the advisor said, you are risk profile 3. And here we see the bulk of clients in risk profile 3, their equity allocation varies between 30% and 50%. And at the extremes, some risk profile 3 clients are getting as low as 15% equity, and some are getting as high as 75% equity. So this is an enormous variation of the actual answers, the investment portfolios that are given to clients where the advisors have already decided that they are a risk level 3. And on risk level 6, for example, you can see the allocations go everywhere from 15% all the way up to nearly 100% for risk profile 6. So again, an awful lot of noise in that system. And when we put these two bits together, so is there noise in assessing the risk level of the client and noise in assessing what solution I give to that risk level, on the next slide, you can see that every one of our 6 clients was effectively, by different advisors, offered an equity allocation that went all the way from nearly 0% to 100% for the same set of client circumstances. And that is the noise. That is the stuff that is extremely concerning, because it tells us that me as a client, I cannot expect to get a stable and a consistent answer from one advisor to the next, or from one advisor at one point in time to another point in time.
Fascinating, Greg. And I certainly agree that we have some work to do, and even agreeing perhaps on what some of these things mean, which could explain some of this noise. Can you perhaps tell us where the noise is coming from?
Yeah, because of the structure of the survey, we were able to tease out some of this. And if you go to the next slide, I'll just point out a few things here. So the first thing there is a certain amount of the noise is coming from where it should. A certain amount of that noise is coming from the circumstances of the client. So if one client is different to another, they should get a different answer. But the characteristics of the investor are only explaining 28% of the variation of the answers of the recommendations that were given. So that is much lower than we would hope for. The jump then from 28% to the next bar, which is 32%, this is variation that is explained by differences in the advisor. So I think, that's quite comforting. It's not very big, but what it tells us is there's a small degree to which, if the advisor is more risk-taking, then that's leaking out onto their client recommendations. So advisors who are themselves more risk-tolerant tend to give clients higher risk portfolios, even if perhaps that's not in the interest of the client. And then the next big jump, up to 54%, these are subjective judgments of the advisor about the client's risk capacity, about the bits of that pyramid, that triangle, and how to put it all together. Now, it is entirely appropriate that advisors are making judgments about the aspects of those triangles, the risk capacity, the risk willingness, etc. The trouble is that particular chunk of variation is coming from advisor judgment, but doesn't seem to be directly related to the characteristics of the investor. And what that tells us is that advisors are using different models, different mental models on how to weight the different bits of information they're given from a client. They don't seem to be using a consistent framework of how to combine the various bits of that pyramid of the things that they need to consider. And then at the top end, what we're left with is 44% of the variation is unexplained by anything, by any piece of data that we input into the system. And that is just pure noise. That tells us that there's just variation of advisors doing different things in a very, very idiosyncratic way.
Thanks, Greg. Now we're going to look at a little bit of what's going on between our ears when we make investment decisions. We all know that we shouldn't drive under the influence of alcohol, but what happens when we make investment decisions under the influence of cortisol? Paul, talk a little about the power of chemicals as a driver of behavior.
Right, thanks, Ray. Let me put you on the spot maybe as we start this with a question, right? So can you remember the first time that you fell in love?
I think so.
All right, so the interesting thing about that is as you even started to recollect, you got a bit of a smile on your face, right? So that actually happens because your brain is releasing a little bit of dopamine when you recollect that experience. And that just really shows us how powerful chemicals are when we make investment decisions, or when we make decisions in general. And that obviously translates to our world of finance as well, which is quite an emotional play as well. So in actual fact, when a study was conducted about on people who were in love, they found that people who were in love their brain experiences a serotonin deficit. Now serotonin is our natural mood stabilizer, and that obviously kind of explains the dramatic mood swings that we sometimes see. But what's also happening is that your brain is setting you up for a hit of dopamine. Now dopamine your brain is using to elicit the correct behavior from you. So dopamine is a powerful reward chemical, and just to give you some context of how powerful that is, I mean, cocaine addicts, for example, what they're after is a hit of dopamine. So as we said, your brain is trying to get you to do the right thing, and the right thing in this case, of course, when you're in love, is procreation, right? So it's passing on your genes. So the hopeless romantics, as human beings, we're very, very good at dressing this kind of stuff up in narratives that the hopeless romantics amongst us might call fate or destiny. But that's pretty much what's happening, right? Your brain is trying to get you to do something. So I think, if we look at those as happiness chemicals being serotonin and dopamine, the other side of that equation, of course, is stress chemicals being cortisol, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that now. So as it turns out, our genes hold very valuable information about our risk preferences. So a study conducted showed that about 100,000 people, or in 100,000 people, that there are 9 areas of the human genome that are related to the personality trait called neuroticism, which of course correlates to anxiety. Now, people who are anxious experience or interpret a greater number of situations as a threat, for example. So what you can see on your screens there is what's happening in your brain as this happens. So your limbic system, which is your center for fear and risk, is passing on chemicals via your pituitary glands to your adrenal glands, which sits just above your kidneys, and that's going to elicit this cascade stress response. So you're going to get, an increased elevated heart rate and an increased blood sugar and blood pressure. But the most important thing here is that a message is going to be sent back to your brain that is going to influence your cognition. So that's the way you're going to perceive the situation and how you're going to perceive risk. And this came out in a study done by the Wharton Business School very clearly that showed that when people have cortisol in their systems, they're far more likely to act on gut instinct, right? So they're far more likely to bypass their rational thinking center and go straight to gut instinct, which is important in terms of our investment decisions.
And I suppose COVID-19 is a great example of an event that caused a lot of anxiety in society. So what did we learn from this, Paul?
Yeah, so there was a lot of activity happening in markets at that time, right? So we saw about 1.5 billion rand switched, from March till December 2020, and obviously COVID hit in March, or the market impact at least hit in March. We saw markets dipping from 57,000 points to 37,000 points pretty quickly. And what happened there was 100 million rand of investors' money was lost, and it was lost from people making switch decisions or intervening in their portfolio or canceling or rather exiting their investment. So we saw that the anxious archetype, and we're going to talk about the archetype shortly, destroyed the most amount of value. So it's people with that anxiety trait destroyed the most amount of value. And of course, what happens here, and we're going to talk about the details, but the anxious investors, for example, need a lot of confidence, or they need markets to give them a lot of confidence to get back into things. And of course, what's happened by that stage is markets have already recovered. So we can see just some other interesting stats here. On average, 6.5% of people's portfolio values were destroyed if they made switch decisions last year. And if you switched, for example, towards the latter part of last year after markets had recovered, you were destroying about 19.44% of your portfolio value per switch. And that's obviously because you were sitting on the sidelines as markets had already recovered.
Wow, 1.5 billion switched and 100 million rand lost. I mean, Greg, you've done a lot of work on something you call market composure. What exactly is this, and how would you measure it?
So composure is very closely related to that psychological trait that Paul mentioned of neuroticism. We prefer to call it composure because it's much easier to go to an investor and say you have low composure than to say you're a neurotic individual. But essentially, it's a part of our personality. Some people more naturally have higher composure, which means they have it's easier for them to keep a focus on the long term and not to get too emotionally involved in the ups and downs of the here and now. Whereas low composure people are those that are very emotionally involved in the present. They feel every bump in the road as the markets go up and down. And when that happens, that leads towards a higher emotional component in our decision making. It leads to much more frequent decision making. And often, as Paul has said, that can be extremely costly because you're reacting to very short-term signals. Whereas as an investor, what we should do, if we're being a good investor, is we should be thinking, how do I set up my portfolio to benefit from the long-term movement of the markets?
This time last year, people were very worried about the market, and some people even switched out of the market. And today, some people are too scared to get into the market because they think it's running hot. We've talked a little about behavior patterns today, and it seems that at certain times, we're more likely to behave in a certain way. And that's just part of our DNA. We're just wired that way. But there are at least 2 human beings involved when advice is given. We have a client, and perhaps their partner, and also the advisor. Paul, let's start off with you and the work you've done on client behavior. Can you quickly take us through the high-level behavior patterns you found on the Momentum Wealth platform and perhaps a big blind spot that each may have?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. So we use some machine learning algorithms to help us just process a massive amount of data, right? So So we had a look at people or investors' decisions and preferences and how these preferences were changing as their investment values were changing. Now, we saw 5 distinct behavior patterns here that we're going to talk quickly about now. So the first one was called, we called the anxious investor. So these are the investors that Greg was talking about, in respect of market composure. So at the first sign of any troubles, they're running for the hills, basically. So the biggest blind spot that they have is definitely loss aversion, right? They're perceiving a situation as a threat, and they're trying to intervene or do something to get away from that threat, right? And there's also, there's a strong anxiety kind of trait to this, right? The next one was the assertive investor, right? So assertive investors are looking for the next big investment idea, right? They're looking at cryptocurrency, at private equity, for example. They're looking for the next big investment fad or idea, and they're looking to chase investments with very, very high performance levels, right? So a very big blind spot here is obviously overconfidence. So we have a trait or a distinct or a tendency as investors, for example, to overestimate our abilities to judge something's, an investment's trajectory or if it's going to increase in value. And the third one was the avoiders. And these are people who just don't like taking much risk at all, right? They kind of sit towards or very, very near to the sidelines, and they're very, very even scared to dip their toes into markets. So they sit or they get stuck in assets that perform or that are quite safe and stable, if that makes sense. And of course, the biggest blind spot here is definitely inflation risk. So what happens with these investors is they don't expose their wealth to risky assets much, which means that inflation becomes quite a big challenge to them. Of course, there is also an element of loss aversion here, which would be prevalent. And then we have market timers. So the market timers, they don't like being different from everyone else, right? So they like being part of the herd or the tribe. And we see this behavior where these investors as markets were increasing, were really chasing past performance. And as markets were decreasing, they were really, de-risking their portfolios quite aggressively to try and get away from the risk levels. So the blind spot here is herd behavior, right? So it's these investors who like to be doing what other people are doing, basically. And then the last one are the contrarians, right? And this was actually a very interesting archetype. So these people were almost your typical Warren Buffett investor who are fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. And we thought this was very interesting because it might have provided a good template here for investing, right? So we saw with contrarians that they were the only archetype to generate a positive behavior tax, right? So they added a tiny little bit of value by switching. Of course, however, on close investigation, we actually saw that this was also the most unstable archetype. So Joe Soap, for example, didn't manage to stay a contrarian in period 1, 2, 3, and 4. It was just all over the place. So it definitely seemed to be a very, very strong element of luck in landing in the contrarian archetype. So it didn't really represent a real person, if that makes sense. And this is pretty much what we found, or the general behavior patterns we found with investors.
And I suppose for that contrarian is that lack of consistency and knowing, you're not an expert, are you, at the end of the day? And Greg, but what about advisors? While they may have their own behavior patterns when investing for themselves, they may very well have a different pattern of behavior or blind spots when they advise on clients' money. And what did you find in your study on the advisor themselves in terms of noise?
Yeah, that's true. So we applied some very similar statistical techniques that Paul has applied to the clients, but we applied it to the data that we have on the study we looked at and the noise. And we've already seen there's a lot of noise in advisor recommendations. But what we're looking for is to say, do certain advisors have tendencies or proclivities to err in a particular direction or to follow, for their advice to follow a certain pattern? And we found 4 clear groups. So the first of these is there's a big bunch of advisors who tend to be slightly more cautious. They, regardless of what the client in front of them, they will tend to offer that client a slightly lower risk level. And these advisors themselves, we see, tend to be those who have slightly lower composure. So that makes sense. To some extent, it's the advisor's personality bleeding over into the advice that they give to clients. There's a group that's unsure. Fortunately, a relatively small group here. These are less confident advisors. Their advice tends to be the noisiest. And interestingly, it's the noisiest largely because they tend to give the same answer to every client regardless of what their client situations are. So these are the guys who are unsure, and therefore they go, oh, well, I'm just going to give everyone the same safe solution. We have those advisors who are more risk tolerance focused. So their advice is definitely more responsive to the client's needs, as we would expect, and is typically they're giving higher risk portfolios to more risk tolerant clients and lower risk portfolios to less risk tolerant clients. And that's as it should be, although even in this group, we do see that there's noise around the advice they give. And then lastly, we see the more relaxed advisors. These are the ones who themselves tend to be higher risk tolerance, higher composure advisors. And again, that is bleeding through into the advice they give to the clients. So they tend to be recommending to their clients a slightly higher risk than other advisors would be, regardless of the client that's in front of them. So, I mean, these are tendencies. I stress that this isn't to say that every advisor in one of these archetypes is doing exactly that for all clients. But these advisors tend to display this kind of tendency to give either slightly less risk to the client in front of them, or slightly more risk to the client in front of them, or in the unsure category. It's pretty much the same answer regardless of the client in front of them.
So you're saying, Greg, that we should be thinking about how we match advisors and clients in order to counteract those kind of blind spots?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting case in point, because that is useful. If you want to help clients to be good investors, it is really important that you give them emotional comfort through the markets. And one of the sources of emotional comfort is to have an advisor that is matched to you. The problem here is that advisors come from a much smaller range of personality types than their clients. So, for example, most advisors tend to be higher risk tolerance, higher composure, higher confidence when it comes to financial decision making than their clients. So many advisors are just going to have to serve clients that are not like them. We can't just do a one-for-one match, because advisors as a group are a subset of the broad client population that they serve.
Interesting, Greg. So you're saying that financial advisors come from a narrower set of personality types compared to, obviously, the personality types that we have in society. So could this be a problem? And if it is a problem, how much of a problem is it?
Well, it shouldn't be a problem as long as advisors are aware of this. And they're using their expertise to give each client the answer, the recommendation that is suitable for their needs, their financial circumstances, their financial personality, and their risk appetites. And the advisors are then not letting their own personality and risk preferences influence the situation.
But from these archetypes, it does seem like advisors are letting their own blind spot impact on clients.
Yeah, and that does seem to be true. I mean, there is this evidence here that says advisors' characteristics are influencing the recommendation that they give to clients in a way that might not be entirely appropriate, but also that advisors, when they consider all the client's situations, when they're combining the psychological risk tolerance, all the aspects of the balance sheet, whether you've got a mortgage, all these bits, that advisors aren't necessarily putting them together in a consistent way, and that's where the noise comes from. So there are definitely circumstances where we could get a very poor match between client and advisor types.
And Greg, the final word is yours. Where do we go from here to address everything we've discussed? I mean, for me as a client, do I now go to my advisor and check what archetype he or she is in order to decide whether the advice that I'm getting is appropriate? And we've seen such a digital transformation with COVID-19. How is this going to affect advice in general? Can a machine check our emotions before we make an investment decision, for example?
So I think your focus there on digital is exactly right. When we're looking at advice, there are so many moving parts to keep track of, so many bits of people's financial circumstances that all have to be combined in a consistent way. And this is the sort of stuff that humans are bad at, juggling lots of pieces of data and combining them into an answer, etc. So this is where technology can definitely help us. The use of technology in order to do some of the profiling, to introduce more objectivity into that process, and the use of technology to do all of the heavy lifting, the combining of this stuff in a consistent framework, that is very useful. And that provides a guidance system to advisors to reduce noise and help make them consistent. But one thing I would say is this is absolutely not about the machine providing the answer, right? The advice process needs to still be human-led. Just knowing what the circumstances are, just having the guidance of what the right answer should look like is not enough to help people stick with that answer. that needs human conversations, it needs empathy, it needs discussions of values. So in our view, the real solution here is better use of technology, decision support tools, decision prosthetics, in order to make the advisors the best version of themselves they can be day to day, and to make them more consistent and reduce that noise.